the CEIA has had an interest in African cultural development. Since the 1960s, it was very obvious. We had organizations called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. There's something called the Mbari Club, which was a major cultural center. And it was revealed that that was funded by the CEIA. Like I said, it's cultural. It's not just religion, all aspects of cultural and civic life.
Hello and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first part here on YouTube and the full episode on our Patreon for members to watch in full. We're just trying to diversify our platform, so please go over there and become a member. And also, it's available as an audio podcast tomorrow on Patreon and also Spotify and Amazon Music. Today, I'm very excited to say that I have on Global Majority for Peace, Sango Omojola. Welcome, Sango. Sango is a socialist and Pan Africanist activist, member of revolutionary Pan Africanist grassroots organization, Movement for African Emancipation, and based in Lagos, Nigeria. Welcome, Sango. This is my first conversation with someone from Nigeria, so I'm very excited to get into it because I don't know that much about Nigeria. Apart from in the West, we hear a lot about Nigerian princes. That's about it.
Yes. You do hear a lot from Nigerians claiming to be princes. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
It's with a lot of money. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm becoming a fan of your show since I heard about it. I think it's actually very important in this time and age, what you do. So I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And we're obviously really honored to have you on. We like to begin each interview on a personal note, and we usually start with a question about the origin of politicization, but I actually want to get into this a little bit more with detail with you because I was reading this article from this Substack about imperialism. The link is going to be in the description, so people should really check this out. But this Substack is from the Coalition for the Elimination of Imperialism, which your organization, Sango, Movement for African Emancipation, MAE, belongs to. I just want to quote from it because I think this will really give us a good framework for the lens in which this interview is going to be discussed, And also, I think the lens in which I hope my channel will kind of look at tangible actions, really, to build a multilateral world. So here goes. We're going to talk about Lenin, guys. As Lenin observed, we live in the age of imperialism, and therefore every social phenomenon that influences our societies must be understood in the context of imperialism. The primary objective of imperialism is to take control of national sovereignty in order to facilitate the accumulation of capital for the imperialist nations at the expense of the countries of the global south. To achieve this, imperialism must find a way to interfere in our internal political processes. I mean, this is a vital context to analyze geopolitics from. And we're going to talk about this even more later in the interview. But I'd like to start with how you personally came to this understanding.
I think that's a very good way to start. I think, for myself, living in a country that is always known to be oil rich, the first thing you start to understand very quickly is that we are wealthy, but the people are poor. We are told we have these resources. And I became conscientized personally around the time when Ken Saro-Wiwa, who I personally met incidentally, but Ken Saro-Wiwa was an activist who was protesting against the destruction of the environment in the Niger Delta by the oil companies, and he was killed as a result of that. And the oil companies, particularly Shell, were very complicit in that. And it gets you asking, when you live in this kind of environment and things like that happen, you are open to the world experience quite, at that time. That was in the 90s. It was also in the 90s when George Bush attacked Iraq, another oil-rich country. So we saw the experiences of countries that have resources in our world. And then, also looking around and trying to learn about the world, I think we come across American figures like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, the Black Panther Party. And those got you to understand that Africans are colonized subjects in this world, wherever they live. So, as the article says, if you are conscientized and political in Nigeria or in Africa, it should be inescapable that, imperialism is the reason for the conditions in which we find ourselves, the poverty in the midst of wealth, and then seeing how also as a people, Africans have been treated. If you did a little bit of history, how Africans have, significantly brutalized. The legacy of all that lives with us. It lives in our psyche. It lives all around us. So before I called myself a socialist, I understood myself to be an anti-imperialist. And I think socialism for me only has to address the question of imperialism, which is what Lenin was fundamental development of Marx that Lenin made us understand.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Thank you for that explanation. That's a really interesting point. And it's like, as we sort of grapple with this statement from that article, it also means that when we look at what's happening in the global south and countries in the global south, as they use tools to try to gain sovereignty, it's not so simple. It's not like, for example, freedom of protest, freedom of speech is like an absolute given. You have to sort of look at those things through an imperialist lens because it can be distorted and weaponized via external forces. One of the things too, like that we can look at, which happened in Nigeria on Christmas Day, was that the US attacked Nigeria on Christmas Day last year. And again, this whole propaganda machine around the pretext for why this US attack happened. The Trump administration designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act, citing alleged killings of Christians. And so this whole US attack, a foreign invasion, was under the pretext of a counter-ISIS operation. And we watched Nicki Minaj sort of famously in November give a speech sort of like supporting Trump and spreading public awareness about Christians being massacred in Nigeria. On the 23rd of January, the presidency of the Federal Republic of Nigeria released a statement from the US-Nigeria Joint Working Group affirming the US's narrative. So the pretext of fighting terrorism is this well-used imperialist playbook that your organization breaks down in the article I quoted above: manufactured terrorism against the alliance of Sahel states. So, sorry, this is a very convoluted question, but basically I'm trying to get to this. Can you help unpack how the US attack on Nigeria fits into this pattern of manufactured terrorism against the alliance of Sahel states?
Yeah. I think in that article, there's a key point that's made. Terrorism and counterterrorism, as done by the US, form a dialectic. They are two parts of the same coin, if you like. So essentially, it's not so hard to see if you look historically and evidentially. The US funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to the development of Al Qaeda, and then we know what happened, and then there was a global war on terror as a result of that. Arising from the global war on terror, we now have the US directly and indirectly working with ISIS and Al Qaeda, having, of course, installed an Al Qaeda man in Syria just recently. And we know very much that the US has a track record, not only terrorists, but drug dealers. So, drug dealers who double up as terrorists. But then look at Africa. I mean, for their own reasons, the US, I think a senator said US aid was funding Boko Haram. Now, some people might think it was far-fetched, but there's nothing far-fetched about it. Actually, I remember very well, there's a work of fiction called The Quiet American by Graham Greene, which looks at, based on the evidence of the time, the US using something called the Economic Aid or something foundation as the cover for his activities in Vietnam and eventually to him carrying out terrorist acts. The reality is very similar. I mean, I think every country can testify to the use of aid as a cover for all sorts of activities. And I think, funny enough, before the US senator said this, Nigerians have been saying this. Nigerians who are active in the north, in the northeast, where terrorism is active, have been saying strange things happen there through these aid agencies. So a military guy was saying that before the senator said it, you know. But then if you read the article Manufacturing Terrorism, you can see, I think, I encourage people to read it, to check past imperialism, the Sahel now. And in particular, this is France, but also the US had a drone base in Niger. And they've been very active in the area. But France in particular, lots of boots on the ground, lots of so-called fighting against terrorism, but the terrorists kept on gaining ground. And this was the reason why the people of the Sahel had enough of France. And it was also, while they were doing that, they were extracting the resources of these regions, maintaining instability, which enables them to extract resources. And you have to ask, apart from the evidence there is for the support of the West to manufacture terrorism, is that if you are going to rely on the West to fight terrorism for you, what is the record been? The record in the Sahel has been terrible. Since the Sahelian changing governments and the formation of the AES, those governments have gained ground that had been lost. They lost territory and so on. But of course, we also see evidence of terrorist acts because they want to regain their power over the Sahel. So they continue to use terrorist acts to destabilize the region. So in Nigeria, there are those, unfortunately, who think that the US will come in and save the day. The evidence of the US or any Western forces defeating terrorism in Africa is actually that they don't actually achieve anything. There's also the case of Libya. I mean, we cannot ignore what the US and NATO and France in particular, as a member of NATO, did to Libya, how the flow of arms from Libya has been instrumental in strengthening the terrorists. So the actions of these Western powers does not speak well in terms of fighting terrorism. So then when we look at Nigeria, because when they started talking about Christian genocide and mixing everything up, they were practically, because they were mixing very different things up altogether. There's a lot of things that cause insecurity in Nigeria. There's also the question of headsmen, different factors. They put everything together, but they were speaking particularly about Boko Haram and Islamic State of West Africa, who are based in the northeast of the country, where most of the problems are in the northeast of the country. They decided to attack the northwest on Christmas Day. This place is also referred to as the Sahel Corridor. So you have to wonder why. And it is quite clear that one of their objectives of their war on terror is to target the Sahel countries, which they see as an opposition to their imperialist activities. Of course, there are other possible objectives with that particular strike, but none of those are about helping Nigeria to defeat the terrorists. It's very strange. I mean, there's a lot you can say about that strike. For example, we don't know what was hit. Nobody can actually particularly tell anything about numbers. People in the area said nobody died. I mean, there's a lot of mess that happened. So you can just imagine this is just one day of an action that they say they want to come and fight terrorism. Just one day and everything is messy. Everything doesn't make sense. But one thing you can really take from that is there is a target on the Sahel countries. There's also an intention of resource extraction, of putting bases in Nigeria to enable them to do more of what they want to do. I mean, the whole area now, the Northeast in that sense, is become a target in the sense of the discovery of mineral resources that are plentiful there, that have been untapped, unmined in a formal, they've not been formally mined. So you have a lot of informal mining going on in those areas. So there's certainly that as well at the top of the agenda. But just speaking in terms of the question about the war on terror and what is achieved by the Western powers, they are not expected to help us to end it. We just have to understand that what they do is manufacture terrorism, and they do practically nothing to end it.
Okay, I have so many questions. So first of all, Nigeria is right next to Niger, right? I'm sorry, I'm like ignorance. I just need to clear this up. And the Alliance of Sahel States are, I think, for most of us anti-imperialists watching the Alliance of the Sahel States, 3 countries that have only really in the last few years, they have actually achieved a sort of revolutionary coup and sovereignty, but this is only in the last less than 5 years, really. And so it's a pretty amazing achievement, but it's very new. So Nigeria, in my thinking, is that a strategic place for the US to infiltrate because it's right next to Niger, and therefore if the US completely gets control of Nigeria, it therefore is like bumping right up against Niger. But my question is the government currently already under the control of Western imperialists in Nigeria?
That's a good question. I'm glad you actually asked that, because there's something I forgot to mention. Now, we have a puppet government, yes. The current president is more puppet than any in history. He's prepared to do whatever they ask him to do. But you have to understand that he has his own internal dynamics of how he manages to gain power. And part of that dynamics is support from the north of Nigeria, the Islamic north of Nigeria, who are going to push back. For example, when the government of Niger, the President Tiani, took power in Niger, President Tinubu was immediately ready to bomb Niger, to invade, and he immediately put on sanctions. He was immediately ready to invade, right? Very recently, there was a coup attempt in Benin Republic. He sent in bombers to bomb. He was going to do the same thing with Niger, and he didn't, because he came under opposition from the Muslim North, who border Niger. These are artificially created boundaries by the colonialists. The people of Niger and the people of northern Nigeria are the same people. They just have a line drawn across. So they opposed it. So he couldn't. He put severe sanctions on the country, took away their electricity. So he was ready. So you can understand that internal dynamic. The reason he was ready to attack Niger was because he was going to do the bidding of the imperialists, just like he did in the case of Benin Republic. But it was not as simple as that. Also understand that Trump came after Tinubu just a few days after. I think the whole thing started to blow off with Ted Cruz, and the others. Just a few days after Nigeria went to the United Nations, the Nigerian vice president, who is a Muslim, who's a northern Muslim, who went to the United Nations and said that there should be a Palestinian state. Just a few days after that these attacks came. So no matter how much of a puppet Tinubu is, you have to understand he has his own internal dynamics. But what has happened since is simply the fact that, being a puppet that he is, as soon as the US came and said, we want to come and attack the terrorists, he invited them. He said, no problem, you can come and do what you want. But there is no Christian genocide, because, of course, again, for them, it will be very difficult for them to claim there's a Christian genocide, given the need to not alienate the northern Muslims who enabled him to gain power. But what has happened since Trump did what he did? Tinubu caved in and said they could do whatever they wanted to. You can contrast that to the attitude of Mali, Burkina Faso, to whenever the US tries to bully them. Just another sign that Tinubu is a puppet, which I wanted to mention, because it's very important. Tinubu is in bed with more than one master. That's the other thing that causes complications. He has built a strong, close relationship with the French. He has invited the French. Immediately, the French were kicked out of the Sahel. Tinubu invited the French to come and gain mining rights in Nigeria. Like I said, a lot of those mineral resources are untapped. They are not yet formalized because Nigeria has concentrated so much on the oil that it hasn't bothered at all to concentrate on lithium, uranium, gold, cobalt, so many different, it hasn't bothered. But now there's a lot of interest in it now, as you see with the whole thing about rare earths and so on. There's a lot of interest. And he went and handed it over to the French. He signed an agreement with the French, inviting them to come in. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Americans were upset with him. But these two masters, he works with them as much as as one will allow him to, the other will allow him to. So to the French, he went to sign a tax agreement that the French should to hand over Nigerians' data to the French for a tax database. So handing over sensitive Nigerian data to the French, which, has raised significant concern in Nigeria. Two, and even of more horrifying implication, just a few days ago, very recently, Nigeria was the first country to sign up to Trump's America First Global Health Strategy, which is to replace USAID in the health scene. And as part of that agreement, Palantir, the surveillance and data body controlled by an American billionaire, which is being used to target ICE, used to support ICE to target innocent people in the United States. Palantir is going to be responsible for the data that is being handed over. So Nigeria is going to hand over its health data to the Americans for an American first global health strategy, which prioritizes Americans' health. And it is certainly of significant concern, and only an unthinking puppet. I think it was Nigeria and Kenya were the first to sign up to it. Kenya is also acting the Kenyan president also acting in a very similar fashion to Tinubu in Nigeria. So I think I personally believe that there has never been a leader more inclined to bend over for the West than this man. Remember, he's also implicated in drug dealing activities in the United States. He's probably a CIA asset. He worked closely with the Americans during the so-called struggle for democracy in Nigeria, at which he built a very significant relationship with the Americans. We've had leaders in Nigeria who have been puppets, who have wanted to do the bidding of the West, but there was always some control. There was always some limits. For example, education, there were some limits to how much you can defund education. There are some limits to how much you can remove the fuel subsidy because it will cause significant pain to the Nigerians. There's a limit to how much you can devalue the currency. Tinubu's predecessor strove, despite being, ready to do so much of the bidding of the West, strove to maintain the currency at a respectable level. Tinubu devalued it significantly. So Nigerians are going through very extreme economic hardship because Tinubu is following the template laid out by the IMF, World Bank, and anything the US wants. So it's the fact the US was not happy with him about so-called Christian genocide. There's a lot of factors to it. I mean, Trump wants to please his Christian base. There's all these lobbies. The Israelis are a key part of that too. We have to remember. The Israelis are very much involved. And so all those factors, because the Israelis are trying to control this narrative to support Christian genocide. And so all of those factors led Trump to do that. But we say everything has calmed down. Two friends are at peace. there might be a little bit of bumping there and there, you know. So that's where we are right now. Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah, this is a huge, very complicated situation. I mean, I think the part that is pretty easy to understand is one, the US is not going to help Nigeria. It doesn't help. US imperialism does not help any countries. It doesn't go into help. It's a US intervention never helps any countries. We can already put that aside. One of the ways in which talking about like imperial tools, one of the very effective ones is religion. And I think like you're sort of talking about this in terms of education. I do think that religion and education is very interlinked in the way that it perpetuates imperialist agendas. So here, you know, we've talked about how the suggestion that there is a Christian genocide. And I suppose this is a way to keep like the narrative up that it is the northern Muslims, like you were saying, the northern Muslims against the Christians in Nigeria. This is like a pretty palatable narrative for most Americans. Like US citizens are very familiar with that idea of like Christians versus like Muslims, or Muslims versus, you know, Jewish people. Like they're used to that sort of narrative, so it's pretty easy for them to digest. But in the article on your organization's website, again, Movement for African Emancipation.org, there's this really good article about the scientific socialist struggle against religious support and sustenance of neocolonial Nigeria. This is a very long title, but essentially it talks about the state of religion in Nigeria today. And I'm just going to quote from it. In Nigeria today, religion is a key institution and tool for maintaining the neo-colonial capitalist state and the societal relations that flows from the structure of that state. So I think we've kind of been talking about it a little bit, but can you help us break down how these groups operate? Which I know is a lot. It's a really big question. But also, I think because earlier in your answer, you said this thing about some Nigerians maybe believing that the US is going to come to save them. I think that in some ways seems shocking, in some ways not shocking, because the amount of US propaganda that is around the world. And I think a lot of that also gets passed through religious institutions. So can you sort of like explain what that looks like in Nigeria?
Yeah, I'm actually really happy that you brought this question. It comes actually at a very topical time. Serious questions are actually being asked currently about the role of religion in Nigeria. This is because of, I don't know if you know him, David Hundeyin, a journalist, has made some revelations that gets you to think a lot about these questions. He has made the allegations that I think, you know, the CIA have been involved in the direction of Christianity in Nigeria towards Pentecostalism, you know, towards very financial driven, exchange driven sort of religion, you know, very individualistic minded.
What was the journalist's name? Sorry, what was the
David
journalist?
Hundeyin.
Okay.
Hundeyin, yeah. I mean, I'll talk more about that. But for me, my own organization, it would be interesting for us to see the discussion right now, because we have always emphasized that there needs to be a challenge to cultural hegemony. It's what I understand as cultural hegemony, of which religion is a part. Cultural hegemony is created and preserved through imperialism. You know, the discussion recently does highlight that the question is not necessarily about religion per se. You know, yes, you know, people are religious and whatnot, but the real problem right now is the type of religion that is practiced by Nigerians, because this serves the interest of empire and of the rule of the local ruling elites. Something, you know, I wouldn't have thought about it in the sense of a directed process by the CIA. But then when I thought about it, I realized that the CIA has had an interest in African cultural development since the 1960s. It was very obvious. We had organizations called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. There's something called the Mbari Club, which was a major cultural center. And it was revealed that that was funded by the CIA. You know, like I said, it's cultural. It's not just religion, all aspects of cultural and civic life. One thing that has actually been quite concerning is that NGOs for example, are having a very negative and pervasive impact on the development of anti-imperialist struggle in Nigeria, because they direct your struggle towards the struggle of personalities, of the local African leaders. The struggle is generally, it's funded by these Western NGOs. So it's like the West is good, Africa is bad, all these things. And there is no question that, like I mentioned at the beginning, that these NGOs are CIA plants in many cases. But it is now, through all these activities, there's a development of a mindset. And I also say that the media is also something that you can get to pass messages in this kind of direction that they want it to go to. And just, going back to religion, again, like I said, people should look out to what Omdeni was talking about. I'm not saying necessarily all of this is directed by the CIA. I'm saying that it is a part of cultural hegemony, that there is certainly a direct interest in maintaining this Nigerians a sort of passivity and a sort of closer relationship with the United States, and they have succeeded through the cultural ways. And in terms of Islam as well, we have Wahhabists. We've always been aware of this from Saudi Arabia. They fund clerics and so on to direct Islam to a version that does not allow for resistance towards the elites or the state. It's rather about cultural change, turning inwards, being against whatever the West or whatever it is, but not against the ruling elites, not against the state as constituted, and certainly not towards socialism. And what is very interesting about this is that the north of Nigeria used to be a place where there was strong belief in socialism and anti-imperialism because of the role of Muslim leaders. Like we had a leader called Aminu Kanu, and they had a movement for the Kalakawas, known as the poor, the masses. So it is not just incidental that the type of religion we practice here has changed to what it is today, which is more subservient, doesn't direct attention towards the structures of the state. It personalizes everything, and particularly does not direct interest, in terms of the Christian version, it does not direct interest towards imperialism. In fact, one of the major pastors, the major prophets or leaders of the Christianity, spoke very fondly of colonialism recently. He said he was using a metaphor, but he talked about allowing yourself to be colonized, speaking in a metaphorical way, but essentially sending the message that being colonized and, not fighting for your independence against the higher power is good, and this is the kind of things they do. There is a lot to say on that, but I think that it's the form, I've tried to explain, it's the form of the religion. You can see that it's not by accident. It seems to be something very strong. And now you have seen the result of it with this whole Christian genocide thing. The fact is that Nigerians have always had this thing about, being very religious, have this thing about the higher power is going to save you. So there's the usual phrase, only God will save us. Only, now it's only the US will save us. We have a problem, so we call on an external body. We have the people have completely turned passive, because we also don't have any traditions of concrete struggle that's really taking hold, which we have not tradition, sorry, currently concrete struggle. We have the strong tradition of concrete struggle in which people strove for change against the structures, fought for independence. But what it is with the whole NGOization of the civic space, with the whole religionization of everything, is that it became much reduced to struggle for people to direct struggle in a way in which we address the structural conditions that give rise to our problems. And if we are going to deal with this issue of religion, then we have to develop, people taking part in active struggle, because people have to move away from passivity to actually starting to struggle, and also to think about why, what are the roots for their problems. So yeah, sorry, I spoke a bit long there, but I hope that answers it.
Yeah, I think it does. And it makes me think about, first of all, since Nigeria borders Niger, and as we said, Niger is part of the Alliance of Sahel States, how much of that anti-imperialist sentiment in Niger, and obviously successfully executed anti-imperialist revolution that happened. How much of that is moving towards Nigeria in terms of the population being aware of that?
It definitely is moving. People are aware of it. And in Nigeria, the thing is, I mean, it will be very hard to find anybody who thinks the democracy we practice is any good for us. The democracy, in quotation marks.
Right.
So, I mean, the AES are not just Niger, but the AES in general is having people question whether we are practicing the democracy and whether it's any good for us, whatever we are practicing. And also, yes, it's bringing to the fore, the problems of imperialism, the fact that imperialism is directly connected. The thing with imperialism is that when you are directly colonized, it's easy to see the enemy. When you are indirectly colonized, it becomes, oh no, it's not imperialism. There's no such thing. But it takes, when what's happening in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, when you are talking about gold mines, uranium that they used to pay less than $1 for per kilogram, and they are paying significantly more for now, then it's easy for you to see why Niger was poor, and easy for you to see, so they're exposing that. For the northern Nigerians, like I said, Niger is not another country. This is an artificially drawn border. So the mentality there is also changed quite significantly. I mean, we had a protest I can't remember, 2 or 3 years ago, where northern Nigerians were holding what seemed to be the Russian flag, supposedly. But it wasn't actually the Russian flag they were holding, but it got mistaken for the Russian flag. And when they were asked why would they support Russia, they were implying that because of what has been going on in Niger and the other countries, that is a better model for them. So if they're with Russia, fine. And, we could see the direct result of how that has influenced people in northern Nigeria. And I think, by the way, I just wanted to say, because when you mentioned the question of religion now, that way the religion has been adapted, or, by the influence of Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism, it has actually been what has germinated this terrorism, which we started out talking about, which the West is very happy. The CIA have their hands in that too. And they're very happy to see the creation of this terroristic and this kind of radical Islamic figures in northern Nigeria, while at the same time, they have the Pentecostal Christians and everybody's at loggerheads. And it's very fine for them to see all this. But when you contrast that to Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, which are Muslim countries, you see that if they had had this kind of attitude in the process of rebuilding their societies, those kind of attitudes start to drain away. In the process of rebuilding or fighting for their countries, those attitudes are not negative, they are positive. The religion is part of the positive aspects of the religion that brought to bear. Yeah.
It's not divisive. It sort of brings them together, maybe, because they're using it in a collective manner about collective good rather than individual, and also external influence. I think that's what we're talking about. And I think, to sort of move on to freedom of speech as well, I'm curious about freedom of speech in Nigeria versus Niger, because I recently read this article about Mali banning a French news magazine, the French news magazine Jeune Afrique. So this is going to be a little bit of a complicated question because I'm sorting it out in my mind. But basically, in my opinion, there's a difference between freedom of speech in the global north or in the Western imperialist countries or countries that are controlled by Western imperialism. That freedom of speech in those countries are probably, I think are extremely necessary. Like freedom of speech in the UK and the US, we should have freedom of speech and absolute freedom of speech. But when we look at countries in the global south that are actually actively fighting for their sovereignty, they've kicked out the imperialists or they're actually trying to have a sovereign country. I think freedom of speech goes down the list. Like it shouldn't be the number one priority in terms of the harmony of rights, because we know that US propaganda is so so extreme. It is all over the world. It's like trillions of dollars. There's no way to actually know how much money they're putting into US propaganda. Like you said, rightly, USAID, NED. I mean, that's just two organizations. We're talking about like so many others, right? So basically, there is a difference. And I'm just curious about how the freedom of speech is in Nigeria currently. Like, is there freedom of speech? Would you say, is there the freedom to speak? And also because Mali just recently did this ban on the French news magazine Jeune Afrique, of course, the Committee to Protect Journalists called on Malian authorities to reverse the ban because it's also been prohibited by the allied military governments, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. So can you explain the differences between the freedom of speech in Nigeria and also how, the freedom of speech in the Sahel states, the alliance of the Sahel states?
Yeah. Well, just like democracy, freedom of speech doesn't mean what it says. It doesn't mean what it says on the pack. So the thing is that you have to know with the West and what it develops, it's always about formalism. It's never about substance. So it's a formalism, it's just freedom of the media, freedom of speech, democracy. In substance, they're anything but what they say they are. In Nigeria, we have, for example, what they call brown envelope journalism. That is, if you have a brown envelope full of money, you buy what is written in a newspaper. Anybody can do it. That is freedom of speech. Freedom of speech for sale, right? Freedom of speech. Because technically everything is free. In the days when we had the military rule in Nigeria, they might close down a newspaper house, seize a lot of newspaper publications. Now we don't have those kind of things. But we still know very well that the journalists are afraid of somebody. Journalists get locked up all the time in Nigeria. They get thrown in prison. We have new cyber laws, cyber crime laws. You can defame the president, for example, by saying he's a criminal. Someone is on trial for that right now. I think, you see, this is the problem. We have to move away from all these formalisms. This is why all this NGOization, all these things about rights, human rights, all these things, they just actually blind us from what actually is real and what is really needed as well. So now we understand that it's not that we don't need democracy, but we don't need something like has been brought, that we have copied from the West. Even if we did it correctly, we don't even do it correctly. But even if we did the democracy the way they supposedly do in the West, it wouldn't be good for us. What we need is the collective good. And as Africans, we understand that it's always been about the collective good. That is the way we practice our practices has never been formalistic in the sense of Western capitalism. For example, if you look at Nigerian African justice system, for example, because the justice system has this whole nonsense about equality before the law. In Africa, you have justice, which is not about retribution, but about, which will require common healing and taking account of how does it impact on the community as a whole. So you move away from this individualism to the community. So now talking about what happens in the West, I think you rightfully put it, in the AA's countries, there's been very strong use of the French media to attack, those countries, and also to cheer terrorists. They actually use this media to cheer the terrorists happily. The case of the magazine you mentioned was doing a case of that. So they are very happy that the terrorists are strong. You see it in their media. They're very happy the terrorists are winning. So they can say, well, you see, you kicked out the French, but you're failing here. And these are also in the case of national security issues. If this is your attitude to terrorists, then how safe are we? I mean, there are questions that have to be asked, that those countries have to ask. But just speaking about the media, the Western media and its influence in Nigeria, we know that the BBC trains journalists, for example, because we are under the English, we're under the British, the other countries are under the French. They do the same thing. They train these journalists and then give them the direction for how they should act, what stories they should write. So how is that freedom of speech? We're talking about the West. I mean, they kidnapped Maduro, and no single Western newspaper can say kidnapped. They say he was captured. If that is the model we are supposed to copy here, then God help us, really. So that's what I'll say.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. That's a really good point. I mean, the reality is it would be great if we all had democracy, human rights, freedom of speech, etc., without imposition from imperialists that are just weaponizing these terms. They don't mean it, obviously. They're just like basically indoctrinating our local populace to think that they are superior in all these ways. There's also been this slew of like a recent Al Jazeera headline saying like militarizing the Sahel will not defeat terrorism. There's another one, about like why silence around military alliances could cost the African continent dearly. It's again, I think it's the same thing of it's essentially this idea of like take away all the weapons from sovereign countries. I mean, not just weapons, but take away all the tools like they can possibly use to maintain their sovereignty. That's what it sounds like. But can you sort of talk about the importance of having a strong military, I think, in terms of these Sahel alliance of Sahel states, or in terms of building a revolutionary country or sovereign nation in Africa, and also the attitude amongst like Nigerians or amongst people in African countries towards that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this issue about only military won't defeat the imperialists. Well, yes,
Sorry,
I mean,
can you say that again?
so that the issue about whether only military cannot defeat the terrorists. I mean, yes, you know, but that is you also need a strong military, right? And you need to get
Right.
all the help you can get. But the
And
issue
it
is
can't
that
be your only weapon, right? That it
yes,
can't be taken away from you. Like I think that's the key.
it has to be strong. I mean, the issue is that, as you say, independence and sovereignty are key. If you are going to be getting outside help to fight terrorists, they must not be on the basis that it will diminish your sovereignty. And it must not, just like any aid, no aid should be tied to your continual dependency. So I think we discussed this in the article you mentioned earlier about manufacturing terrorism as well. You have to build an independent security force, which they are doing in the AES. They've built a joint security force, trying to strengthen them, because the mentality of the AES is not just in terms of the military, but in general, is to work with partners that would help, but only insofar as that help is to build your independence, to build your ability to continue to do the same thing by yourself. But also, everybody knows, I think everybody should know that you don't defeat terrorism without the support of the people, without popular support. You can't just defeat terrorists by bombing from the sky. That's one problem why this American thing is very laughable. No one can come and throw bombs at terrorists from the sky, and that's it. For one thing, you're going to build support of the people, but quite key to that is economics. You have to improve the material conditions of the people, which implies taking back resources that the imperialists have taken to develop education, healthcare, and so on. In that way, you build relationships and trusts as well. So the fact that the AAS countries are building sovereignty while at the same time fighting terrorism, you know that yes, there are challenges, but you know that they are doing things the right way. This is the way you fight terrorism. It's not about having bombs alone, and it's not saying we don't want external partners. It's understanding what those external partners are bringing and how we can strengthen ourselves. Of course, like for example, in the AAS, they have empowered members of the population to have self-defense. They're training students in civic values, self-defense. And these educational activities also make young people less amenable to being influenced externally. And all these things that are being done in the AAS, which is crucially, they're having people participate and have ownership of the struggle. That is the crucial thing. And all these things are missing in Nigeria. In Nigeria, you see the thing is, and maybe why I would say I can understand why some people want to see the US come in, is the fact is that our ruling elites benefit materially from the terrorism themselves. They steal the security funds. The generals are stealing the money meant for arms. The politicians are turning a blind eye. They're also taking part of it. And of course, so they're not going to really succeed in fighting terrorism. But they also have impoverished communities. They do nothing to support them. They do nothing to build relationships with them. Do nothing to build trust. When they go in with their bombs, they just bomb any and everybody. So, of course, the Nigerian model is never going to help. It's not never going to work. Not the way they are doing it internally, and not by bringing in the Americans, because everything is just done the wrong way around. Now, because of what we are doing in Nigeria, we have a serious problem. I mean, Nigerians who complain about terrorism, they have it's because there's a serious problem right now, very very serious problem, and it's not just terrorism. We have a very serious increase in banditry, kidnapping, all sorts of criminalities. People are being kidnapped every day. People are losing their lives because the security in the country is very lax. The poverty is very high. All the factors needed to fight crime, not just terrorism, are absent. So yes, we do have a very failed government, very failed security forces, which unfortunately it's not going to be solved by bringing in the Americans, but it is still a fact that the situation here is very critical right now. Yeah.
Is there any anti-imperialist movement on the ground that you're seeing has potential?
Anti-imperialist movements on the ground in Nigeria? Not right now. No.
This leads me to, I guess, the question of what are your tasks ahead for your organization? Movement for African Emancipation. What, in your opinion, is your biggest focus in the coming years?
So, when you mentioned the question about anti-imperialist movements on the ground, we have to build an anti-imperialist movement on the ground. That is the key task. And I also have to say, in that context, this is a very crucial time in world history, with what is going on in the world right now. Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso talked about a black winter that we have to prepare for. Winter has come, basically, or winter is coming. I mean, we have been dealing with imperialism, the consequences of imperialism, but rather than even things getting better for us or the imperialists letting us be, they keep on coming in stronger and stronger, and they do not let us to. They do not let those who resist to survive. So, we have the history of Thomas Sankara being assassinated, Kwame Nkrumah. But now we're in this period of history where people are much more conscious about imperialism. Because, of course, it is ever more present in your face than it used to be. So there's this opportunity to educate and conscientize and to build a new mindset of people. So the task is to build a new social movement or social movements that have a strong anti-imperialist and socialist foundation. You have to move away from this kind of NGO-directed human rights advocacy type of struggle that I spoke about, which has actually been used to water down our struggle over time. So we have to, taking that into account, being very aware of it, and being in a period in which there is this kind of anti-imperialist bloc that is being created. Because, in the old days when the Soviet Union existed, there were so many movements, struggles for liberation across the continent. The fall of the Soviet Union had the very direct impact on movements in Nigeria. And this is kind of part of the factors into why there was this kind of move towards this kind of human rights, democracy, activism, which is all NGOism, charity work, rather than developing, movement that can actually empower people to take power into their own hands, to struggle for structural change, but through their struggle that they are empowered to start to demand a change in their living conditions, in their material conditions, and to start to think about an alternative to the capitalist states that is ruining us, to the imperialist capitalist state. So for us, our task is to engage on the ground for the development of such, and also to engage in the air through the media, where people, particularly in the social media, there's a lot of awareness about the realities in this world. And it's just our work is to bring people to much more consciousness about how imperialism is the reality of our time, because of it that we are in the conditions in which we're in, and we have to organize ourselves to build a new society. So that's I think our task. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I think too that it's the fall of the USSR. I mean, I do kind of want to tease out this part where it's like the anti-communist Washington-led campaign. It was all over the world, you know. The USSR, of course, the fall of the USSR was an incredible symbol in some ways, but it's not to say that every part of the world was not grappling with this anti-communist like operations, covert and overt operations, like we're saying, propaganda, misinformation, but also actual on the ground operations, sanctions, like everything that, you know, we're talking about. And for me, I think that the Alliance of Sahel States is like we talked about before, it's precarious because it's new, but it's hopeful because it does seem to herald a new possible multilateral world. I noticed on your website again, you covered Ibrahim Traore's New Year address, and he did mention building more relationships with China and Russia. Can you talk a little bit more about those relationships and sort of what we can expect in the future? Because one thing I'm really getting from this interview is that although Nigeria at the moment, it on one hand is like extremely difficult to see the pathway forward in terms of an strong anti-imperialist movement. But at the same time, because it borders the Alliance of the Sahel States, once those states really rise, you know, it's like what Deng Xiaoping said about like development being the hard truth. It's like once those countries rise up and they develop, the people around those countries are going to see the evidence of how socialism can help them through that, or how sovereignty can help them rise up. So I do think this is a very optimistic moment, but can you just talk about how they are working with other sovereign countries like Russia and China?
Yeah. Very much share the sentiments you have shared, and that is for us why the AES is so important, you know, and China too. The imperialists are very powerful with propaganda and all that, but there is no escaping the hard evidence. And I think Nigerians can see what's going on in the AES. And by and large, you know, yes, there are things people say about China. So I think it's important to say some things about China, because not even necessarily Russia, but China, because there is this kind of propaganda about China, and it's a very deliberate propaganda from the West, you know, that people do buy into, you know, just another imperialist, you know, that kind of thing. But also what can also be denied among Nigerians is that the model that China is using works. The evidence is there that the model, the Communist Party model, works. So just to speak of China as a partner for Africans, I think one thing, again, with the evidence is that China does not act like an extractive imperialist. You know, it doesn't just come to take and leave the place in ruins, you know, and this is by building infrastructure that could enable industrialization. It's very important. And for someone who understands, for we Africans, in understanding imperialism the way it is in the format it is today, if you read Kwame Nkrumah, Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, Nkrumah tried to make something clear there, that the problem isn't the use of foreign capital, that poor nations need foreign capital. The problem is that foreign capital is used to exploit poor nations rather than to develop them. So the idea that you are not going to need some partners or some support to develop, that idea, you know, it's not going to be correct. Like I've been saying before, you must go out of dependency. You must build your sovereignty, you know, and that's on the basis of it in this world of today, is to stop being exporters of raw materials and to become industrialized countries. That should be the aim of African countries. That's why some the Ibrahim Traore, you know, the others in are trying to move away from just mining gold to processing gold, for example, to building factories. So just say the AES states have been very careful to build relationships on the basis that their sovereignty is not compromised. So the support they get can build the structures that can enable them to be independent. They have done that in the fight against terrorism. Again, like I explained before, when they built a joint force, to improve their own capabilities, building refineries. Russia has particularly tried to see how there are discussions about building nuclear, building power plants, the training of people in technical skills that can be transferred back at home. So I think the approach of Russia and China is very different from the imperialist model that we have had, which is based on extraction and building permanent dependency. I want to actually give an example from Nigeria just to show what it means, the differences, because, we're just speaking about the Soviet Union, right? In the 70s, Nigeria wanted to build a steel mill, which will enable it to become industrialized. It has the iron ore to turn it into steel. So it went with former colonizer, Britain, and Britain refused to help. So Nigeria ended up going to the Soviet Union. And though there are language barriers, if you're going to do something that technical, you're going to train people. But it was the Russians that built the plant. But they built the plant. The Nigerians ended up not using it because the imperialists forced them to not use it. And they basically found different ways to prevent the use of that steel mill. To the extent that Russia, which is no longer communist, in I think 2000 and can't remember what year, the 2000s, wrote to the Nigerian authorities. I've seen that letter. They wrote to the Nigerian authorities that they would like to come and finish the plant and get it started back up again. And today, 2026, the plant is still not back up. The West frustrated the execution and use of that steel mill because they would frustrate the industrialization of Africa. They simply need Africans for resource extraction. And I think that's something clearly that the AAS countries are very aware of, which is why the entire basis is to constantly emphasize that we are not just here to have our resources extracted. Yes, we are going to use the resources in the meantime, but even then, we have to go up the value chain. We have to go up gold processing. We have to see how we can build, for example, importing textiles. We have to stop doing things like that. And, it's a process. Some sort of act as if these things happen in a day, in a year. It's a process. You have to show the intention and start to move towards it. And also those who act as if you can't have partners. That is not realistic. That is never absolute. That the people who don't live in the real world who think you don't have partners. But in any case, just the last point, because for me it's very important. This formalism of the West impacts on the thinking of a lot of people. So when they think about imperialism, they think of it in a very formalistic way. Even those on the left, imperialism is simply going somewhere else and taking land. Imperialism is simply going somewhere else and having an exchange relationship, whatever, So taking land, for example, I think there was someone I was listening to recently who explained very clearly that we have extractive imperialism. And we have in history where there's the incorporation of land, which is not about extraction. So to simply think of imperialism in a very formalistic manner, that all type of things are just imperialist, it's just silly. But that is, I'm even making this point not to even suggest that like China or Russia are trying to do anything imperialist. I think in our modern day and world, what we should understand as imperialism, what Lenin explained it to be, is as an extractive enterprise where foreign capital is used to exploit other nations, not to develop them. So if we have a partner and we say to that partner, we want railways. The British, what did the British, when they were in Nigeria or in Africa, what they did? They built railways just to take the goods out from the mines to the ports. And they built nothing. They built no higher education institutions. They did not have, nothing of any worth, and they left. And what happens is under neo-colonialism, the neo-colonialists behave the same way as the direct colonialists. They don't want you to build railways. They don't want you to build power plants. They don't want you to build schools. They defund your education, defund your healthcare. But when you have a partner that says, if you need whatever you need, just let us know. We'll be ready to have you build it. That is not imperialist. And those are partners that actually we need. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with that. And I think as countries in the global south reach more sovereignty, more power, more development, then the terms of the negotiation can be better. I mean, I think that's kind of one of the misunderstandings with China. Say, like, if a government is a US puppet and doesn't think about how to progress its country or how to look after its people, the terms that they will make with China are not going to benefit their people. So it's like, it's going to be different if you are one of the alliance with the Sahel states where you've already stated your goal of like helping your people. Your terms with China are going to be like much, much better. I mean, I think that's the other thing that people kind of forget, you know, in this thing. Like, we can't infantilize countries in the global South. They also need to be at the state where they can demand better terms. It's going to be on the forefront of their mind. But yeah, I think that we're in an optimistic, but like you said, like that's an interesting thing to say, the Black Winter. We're in the, maybe we're in the Black Winter because we're also in an, at the same time in an optimistic point. And like US imperialism is going to be at its absolute most belligerent as it's losing power. So it's also the scariest time, I suppose. But thank you so much for coming on and like teaching me a lot about that region. I really appreciate all of your knowledge. And I'm actually going to check out that book, The Neocolonialism is the End Stage Capitalism.
The last stage, the last stage of imperialism. So,
last
you know, like we started there by talking about Lenin. And so Lenin notes imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism.
Highest stage of capitalism, yes. I have
So
that book.
Nkrumah wrote neocolonialism. Is it the highest stage or the last stage of imperialism? Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I do need to read that because when you were talking about foreign investment there, I was like, yeah, that's such a good point because I always hear a lot of Western leftists talk about foreign investment as if that's the only marker for imperialism. And so if like China does foreign investment, it is imperialist. It's like, what?
Yeah.
That doesn't actually make sense. You know, it's really undermining what imperialism is. But so yeah, so thank you for that. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for watching Global Majority for Peace. We will be back next week. So thank you. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Okay.